The cold, artificial light swept across the amphitheater from overhead panels, casting harsh shadows that seemed to dance across the alien faces of the students. The lecture hall, shaped in a perfect semicircle, hummed with the quiet anticipation of 40 different species gathered for the first class of the semester. Each row curved around a central holographic display where Professor Vorj Zelnara stood, her Zithian skin reflecting the light in a way that made her seem almost translucent. Marcus Nakamura sat in the back row, his stylus poised over his tablet. The only human exchange student at the Interstellar Institute of Xenobiology. The massive space station, Hollow Arc 07, orbited a dying dwarf star at the edge of the Andromeda constellation. Through the reinforced windows, that dying star cast a reddish glow into the classroom, complementing the stark, institutional lighting. Today, Professor Zelnara's voice resonated with a harmonics that made the crystalline students vibrate slightly. We begin our study of apex predatory evolution with the most dangerous living entity in charted space. The hologram flickered to life in the center of the room. A massive creature materialized, 3 meters long, covered in pitch-black fur that seemed to absorb the surrounding light rather than reflect it. Its eyes glowed like dying embers, and claws extended from massive paws that could shred through the strongest armor. The Shadow Moor of Real Prime stood before them, rendered in perfect, terrifying detail. Several students instinctively retreated in their seats. Prismel, a Zithian student 2 rows in front of Marcus, dimmed her bioluminescence in what Marcus recognized as their species' fear response. The 3 Nebulan students, existing as a collective cloud of sentient particles, contracted into a tighter formation. Buzzwick, a Dronian with an exoskeleton, partially retracted into his protective shell. Only Marcus and Ariath, a crystalline student whose body resembled polished obsidian with glowing blue veins, leaned forward with interest. The Shadow Moor, Professor Zelnara continued, manipulating the display to show the creature in motion, has been responsible for the extinction of 17 sentient species. Its speed reaches 80 kilometers per hour. It can detect electromagnetic signatures at 3 kilometers. Its claws can pierce Class 5 armoring. The only successful neutralizations have involved orbital bombardment or complete surface sterilization of affected planets. The hologram shifted to show the creature pouncing on what appeared to be an armored research station. The facility crumpled like paper beneath the Moor's weight. There is no documented case of successful communication or pacification. Zelnara's voice hardened. The Shadow Moor represents the purest form of evolutionary perfection in predation. It has no natural predators, no weaknesses, and no interest in anything beyond hunting and killing. Marcus's hand rose before he could reconsider. Professor Zelnara's head turned sharply, the movement almost reptilian in its precision. Yes, human Nakamura? I was wondering, Professor, if anyone has attempted to use positive reinforcement techniques to establish communication with the Shadow Moor? The silence that followed was absolute. Even the environmental systems seemed to pause. Prismel's bioluminescence flickered erratically. Ariath's crystalline form produced a series of calculations that flashed across his surface. Probability of success, 0.001%. The nebulons dimmed to near invisibility. Buzzwick disappeared completely into his shell with an audible click. Professor Zelnara's expression shifted through several emotions before settling on contempt. That would be, she said slowly, a remarkably unscientific approach. Human Nakamura, and a fatally foolish one. Marcus didn't lower his hand. With respect, Professor, the Shadow Moor displays all the markers of high intelligence, tool use, social structures, and complex problem-solving. If it were any other species, we would consider it a moral obligation to attempt communication before resorting to extinction protocols. The Shadow Moor is not a pet, Zelnara snapped, her skin pulsing with angry patterns. It is a biological extinction event, Any approach would be suicidal. But if it's intelligent, Marcus pressed, how can we deny the possibility that it has emotions, that it can learn? Every predator I've studied on Earth responded to proper behavioral techniques. The classroom erupted in a mixture of nervous chittering, crystalline vibrations, and gasps. A Zelian student named Druvit, who had previously studied predatory animals, looked at Marcus with what might have been admiration, but remained silent. Professor Zelnara's eyes narrowed to slits. For a moment, it seemed she might dismiss the class. Instead, her posture straightened, and a different emotion crossed her face, something between scientific curiosity and a desire to publicly disprove an irritating theory. Perhaps, she said finally, a practical demonstration would be more instructive than theory. The class fell silent again. Tomorrow morning, 0800 Galaxy Standard Time, we will conduct a field trip to the Shadowmoor containment habitat. Security protocols will be observed. Colonel Zreth. She nodded to the Vorik security advisor, standing by the door. We'll brief you on safety procedures. The massive Vorak stepped forward, his exoskeleton rattling slightly with each heavy step. Biohabitat access is level 5 restricted. Only authorized personnel permitted. All visitors will wear exosuits with continuous biometric monitoring. Professor Zelnara's gaze locked on Marcus. Human Nakamura will be granted special observation access, if he wishes to test his theory about communication. Marcus felt every alien eye in the room turn toward him. You will, of course, the professor added with a cold smile, be required to sign comprehensive liability waivers, acknowledging the extreme danger and accepting full personal responsibility for any outcomes. As the class ended, students filed out in stunned silence. Marcus remained seated, processing what had just happened. Had his academic curiosity just volunteered him for a death sentence? Buzzwick emerged just enough from his shell to speak, his voice muffled. You're certain to get yourself killed. The Shadowmoor isn't called the galaxy's apex predator for nothing. Perhaps, Marcus replied, gathering his materials. But someone has to challenge assumptions, or science never advances. Inside, though, a flutter of doubt made his heart race. Did he truly have the courage to stand 10 meters from a creature that had decimated entire planets? And if he failed, he would become not just another statistic, but the punchline to a cautionary tale told to future xenobiology students. That evening, Marcus sat cross-legged in his quarters, scrolling through every scrap of research on Shadowmoor vocalizations. Most were classified as threat displays, but he found scattered references to what researchers called chatter, complex sounds produced when Shadowmoors encountered objects of curiosity rather than prey. He practiced making similar sounds, feeling ridiculous but determined. From his personal supplies, he selected several high-energy nutrient gels, brightly colored emergency rations that might serve as potential positive reinforcement. He then spent an hour in meditation, controlling his breathing and heart rate. If he was going to face the galaxy's most feared predator, he needed to project calm and confidence, not fear. Across the station, other preparations were underway. Professor Zelnara reviewed security protocols with Colonel Zreth, adding additional seismic sensors, short-range bioradar, and a medical team standing by. Despite these precautions, she maintained her position. The Shadowmoor cannot be domesticated or reasoned with. Tomorrow will provide valuable data, but not the kind human Nakamura hopes for. Prismal wrote notes for her ongoing xenobiological thesis, adding a macabre entry. If human Nakamura dies, I must prepare psychologically to continue studies on the new Riel prime hypothesis. Buzzwick paced nervously in his quarters, his exoskeleton clicking with each step. Are you absolutely certain? Nothing good can come of this. He had warned Marcus before retreating for the night. Arioth recalibrated his observational lenses, adjusting thermal cameras to record every bodily reaction from both the human and the predator. The night before the field trip. Hollow Arc 07 felt quieter than usual. The corridor lights dimmed to simulate night, casting long shadows that seemed to presage the danger awaiting them all. Even the station's recycled air felt heavier, charged with anticipation. Morning arrived with the artificial precision of space station routine. Students assembled outside the containment facility's massive security doors, each fitted with an exosuit featuring multiple protective layers and monitoring systems. Marcus methodically pulled on his boots, looking up at his classmates. "Ready?" he asked, more to himself than anyone else. The double security doors parted, with a pneumatic hiss. White light from powerful flood lamps reflected off polished walls as the group entered the antechamber. After passing through additional security checkpoints, they finally entered the observation deck overlooking the habitat. Below them, through reinforced transparent aluminum, lay the carefully constructed environment designed to mimic Real Prime's natural conditions. The air was regulated at 45% humidity, 20 seconds, with a metallic tang mixed with the distinctive musk of apex predators. Granite formations rose from reddish soil, and sparse vegetation resembled the semi-tropical ecosystem of the Shadow Moor's homeworld. In the center of the habitat lay the creature itself, a massive black form, deceptively still. 3 meters of coiled muscle covered in midnight fur, eyes closed but still, somehow radiating threat. The students crowded behind the glass, whispering and breathing heavily. Marcus adjusted his communications equipment, double-checking the audio feed. Professor Zelnara stood nearby, her expression unreadable as she monitored the biometric data streaming to her tablet. "The observation will commence in 30 seconds, she announced. "Human Nakamura, you may proceed to the habitat entry point if you still wish to test your hypothesis." Marcus nodded, his mouth suddenly dry. The gravity of what he was about to attempt hit him fully. He forced himself to focus on his breathing. "I need to concentrate on its body language," he reminded himself silently. The final security door opened with deliberate slowness. Marcus stepped through into an antechamber where Colonel Zreth waited with a final warning. "1 minute of unresponsive behavior. We extract you. Any aggressive movement from the subject, we extract you. Understand?" Marcus nodded. The inner door opened, and he stepped into the habitat. The shadow. Moore's eyes snapped open instantly, twin red embers tracking his movement with predatory focus. Marcus removed his protective helmet, a gesture that caused gasps from behind the observation glass. Rather than maintaining the recommended safe distance, he sat cross-legged on the ground about 10 meters from the creature, adopting a relaxed posture. "Hello, Shadow Moore," he said in a warm, slow, clear voice. "I've come to ask you a few things. Please stay calm. I mean no harm." The universal translator embedded in his suit would convert his speech into sound frequencies closer to the Shadow Moore's hearing range. The predator immediately tensed, rising to a crouch with startling speed. But instead of charging, it observed Marcus's still form with what appeared to be confusion. Its muscles rippled beneath black fur as it extended razor-sharp claws, but remained in place. Its eyes tracked every centimeter of Marcus, displaying unmistakable curiosity. Marcus slowly began producing some of the chatter sounds he had practiced, a series of low, resonant hums, punctuated by soft clicks. The Shadow Moore's ears pricked forward, head tilting slightly. And then, something extraordinary happened. Instead of advancing, the Shadow Moore took a deliberate step backward, maintaining a cautious distance. The observation room fell into shocked silence. The creature produced a deep, resonant sound. "Rurka!" "Yes, I understand," Marcus responded softly. "I'm not your enemy." The Shadow Moore's gaze shifted from aggressive to investigative. It lowered its claws, flattened its ears, and dipped its head slightly toward Marcus in what resembled a gesture of respect or acknowledgement. Behind the glass, Professor Zelnara stood frozen, her tablet forgotten in her hands. "Retreating," she murmured. "It's retreating, although it's not attacking." Despite her scientific detachment, her voice betrayed emotion as she instructed. "Document immediately. First recorded non-aggressive response from Shadowmoor specimen." Marcus carefully withdrew one of his emergency nutrient gels, a bright blue capsule containing concentrated energy compounds. With deliberate slowness, he placed it on the ground before him. The Shadowmoor approached with cautious steps, nostrils flaring as it analyzed the unfamiliar scent. It extended its tongue to taste the gel, chewed thoughtfully, and placed one massive paw on the ground, a careful, non-aggressive gesture. A soft hissing sound emerged from the creature, something between gratitude and tentative trust. The environmental sensors recorded a 2°C decrease in the Shadowmoor's core temperature, the opposite of what occurred during aggression. Vibration sensors detected a heart rate below 70 beats per minute, well under alarm thresholds. Audio channels captured sounds with frequency patterns matching social communication rather than threat displays. This unprecedented data streamed back to the Institute's command center, stunning everyone who monitored the feeds. For the first time in recorded history, a Shadowmoor had responded non-violently to contact. The next morning, Professor Zelnara invited the class back to the lecture hall. She displayed the complete video, audio, and environmental data from the encounter. Marcus explained with quiet confidence. "We've fundamentally misunderstood the Shadowmoor. We assumed it was driven only by predatory instinct. But by approaching with respect and attempting basic communication, we broke through that instinctual barrier." Prismal sat up straighter, her light spectrum radiating in rainbow patterns, the Zithian expression of profound realization. "The biometric readings contradict everything in our textbooks," she admitted. Buzzwick extended his graspers, overcoming his fear for the first time. "Professor, I think perhaps we've overlooked the emotional aspect of these creatures." The Institute issued an internal memorandum. Shadowmoor specimens demonstrate social behaviors and potential for communication under specific conditions. All theories regarding apex predator species require comprehensive revision. Colonel Zreth shook his head but nodded, silently adjusting security protocols. "Prepare for a second trial, but maintain weapons at increased readiness." In subsequent classes, students from every species eagerly applied to join the Apex Predator Contact Program, hoping to expand communication with other supposedly unapproachable species. Marcus was assigned to author the first scientific paper on the Shadowmoor Communication Program. As he completed his draft, he turned to gaze through Hollow Arc 07's kaleidoscopic window at the dying dwarf star beyond. "If we can understand the Shadowmoor," he thought, "what other species across the galaxy might be waiting for us to reach out?" In the final scene, the Shadowmoor stood at the habitat entrance, watching as Marcus departed. Its red eyes reflected a new emotion, something like longing. The overhead lights illuminated the scene like a promise of a friendship not yet defined, opening infinite potential for the future. The class that had once huddled in terror now leaned forward in fascination. The impossible had become possible, and with it, the universe had become both larger and smaller simultaneously, more mysterious, yet somehow more comprehensible. As Marcus exited the habitat for the final time that day, the Shadowmoor made a sound none of the monitoring equipment had recorded before. A soft, almost melodic series of clicks and purrs that made even Professor Zelnara pause in surprise. "What's it saying?" asked Ariath, his crystalline form shimmering with excitement. Marcus smiled. "I think," he said quietly, "it's asking when I'm coming back." In the weeks that followed, the Shadowmoor's behavior continued to evolve. It began arranging objects in its habitat in patterns that suggested primitive communication attempts. It responded to recorded audio of Marcus's voice with attentive posture. Most remarkably, it displayed none of the aggression that had defined its species in scientific literature. Professor Zelnara found herself fundamentally re-evaluating her life's work. For 3 decades, she confessed to her colleagues, I have studied ways to neutralize apex predators. Perhaps now we should be studying ways to understand them. The implications extended far beyond academic interest. Throughout the eternal stellar alliance, species that had lived in terror of Shadowmoor incursions began to consider alternatives to the scorched earth policies that had been standard procedure. If communication was possible with the galaxy's most feared predator, what other assumptions might be challenged? Marcus's original question in the classroom had rippled outward, touching minds across dozens of worlds. Sometimes, the most revolutionary scientific advancement wasn't a new technology or discovery, but simply asking a question no one else had dared to ask. 6 months later, Marcus stood before the Xenobiological Congress, presenting his findings to representatives from 200 worlds. Behind him, a live feed showed the Shadowmoor, now participating in complex communication trials with a team of researchers. The universe isn't divided between predators and prey, Marcus concluded his presentation. It's populated by beings seeking to understand each other across the barriers of evolution, biology, and fear. The Shadowmoor taught us not just about its species, but about our own capacity for connection when we approach the unknown with respect rather than weapons. As applause filled the hall, Marcus thought about that first moment when the Shadowmoor had stepped backward instead of attacking. Sometimes, he reflected, the most profound change begins with a single step in an unexpected direction. Back at the Institute, Professor Zelnara was meeting with a new class of students. The hologram at the center of the room still showed the Shadowmoor, but now it included footage of the creature engaging in peaceful interaction. Today, she told them, we begin by challenging what we think we know. A young Dronian student raised his appendage. Professor, is it true that human Nakamura established communication with the Shadowmoor simply by showing respect? Zelnara's skin rippled with colors that indicated both humility and pride. He demonstrated, she said carefully, that science advances not just through observation, but through courage, and sometimes through challenging even our most fundamental assumptions. In his quarters that evening, Marcus reviewed the latest data from the ongoing communication trials. The Shadowmoor had begun responding to complex commands, distinguishing between shapes, and even initiating interaction. Its neurological patterns had changed, showing increased activity in regions associated with social behavior in other species. A message alert flashed on his tablet, Professor Zelnara requesting his presence at tomorrow's research coordination meeting. The subject line read, Proposal for Shadowmoor Field Study on Real Prime. Marcus smiled. From classroom theory to controlled habitat to native environment, the journey of understanding was just beginning. As he gazed out his viewport at the dying star, he wondered what other misconceptions awaited correction across the vast expanse of space. The Shadowmoor had been the galaxy's most feared predator. Now, it was becoming its most studied communicator. And that transformation had begun with a single question in a classroom, asked by someone willing to see beyond fear. The next morning, as Marcus approached the habitat for his regular session, he noticed something different. The Shadowmoor wasn't waiting by the entrance as usual. For a moment, concern flickered through him. Had they lost the progress they'd made? Then he saw it. In the center of the habitat, the creature had arranged small rocks in a pattern that unmistakably resembled the layout of the classroom, where Marcus had first asked his question about communication. In the center of this crude model, the Shadowmoor had placed the bright blue wrapper from the nutrient gel Marcus had offered during their first encounter. As Marcus stepped into the habitat, the Shadowmoor approached with measured steps, its movement now familiar, respectful, rather than threatening. It produced the series of clicks and purrs that the research team had come to recognize as its greeting vocalization. Professor Zelnara watched from the observation room, recording every detail. Symbolic thinking, she murmured into her data recorder. Object permanence, memory association. Everything we believed about Shadowmoor cognitive limitations appears to be incorrect. The habitat doors opened again, and Prismel entered cautiously. As part of the expanded research program, other students were now being introduced to the Shadowmoor under controlled conditions. The Zithian's bioluminescence pulsed with nervous energy. The Shadowmoor turned, regarding the new arrival with evident curiosity. Instead of retreating or displaying aggression, it repeated the same greeting sounds it had used with Marcus, then lowered its massive head in the same respectful gesture. Prismel's light pattern stabilized into a calm blue glow. "It recognizes me as non-threatening," she said with wonder. "Just as you predicted, Nakamura." Behind the observation glass, Arioth's crystalline form calculated new probabilities, the numbers flashing across his surface. Probability of successful communication with new researchers, 78.3% and rising. That evening, the research team gathered to discuss their findings. The data was unequivocal. The Shadowmoor was not merely tolerating human presence, but actively engaging in social learning. It had begun mimicking certain gestures, anticipating routine events, and even displaying what could only be described as pleasure when communication was successful. "We need to consider," Marcus suggested, "that the aggressive behavior documented in wild Shadowmoors might be defensive rather than predatory. Perhaps their attacks on settlements were responses to perceived threats." Professor Zelnara nodded slowly. "Which would explain why orbital bombardment and surface sterilization only spread the problem. We were confirming their perception that other species were dangerous." Colonel Zreth, who had maintained a skeptical stance throughout the project, finally spoke. "If what you're suggesting is true, we've been handling incursions exactly wrong for the past century. Instead of weapons, we should have been using communication specialists." The implications were staggering. 17 species extinct, dozens of planets rendered uninhabitable, all potentially because of a fundamental misunderstanding. "We can't change the past," Marcus said quietly, "but we can ensure the future is different." 3 days later, the Institute's governing council approved the unprecedented field study proposal. A research team would travel to Real Prime, the Shadowmoor's homeworld, to observe them in their natural habitat and attempt to establish communication with wild specimens. As preparations began for the expedition, Marcus spent increasingly longer periods with their Shadowmoor subject, which the team had begun calling Ambassador in their informal discussions. The creature's progress continued to astonish everyone involved. It had developed a vocabulary of approximately 30 distinct vocalizations, each with consistent meaning. It could follow complex instructions and had begun using rudimentary tools provided by the researchers. Most remarkably, it showed what could only be described as affection, greeting Marcus with excited vocalizations, presenting him with objects it had arranged, and displaying visible distress when sessions ended. "We've been wrong about everything," Buswick admitted during a team meeting. "Not just about Shadowmoors, but about the very nature of predator species." The Nebulan trio, who had initially dimmed to near invisibility at the mention of Shadowmoors, now maintained a bright, interested formation during discussions. "We have been documenting all encounters as a living memorial," they communicated through their translator. "This will become foundational knowledge for future generations." 2 weeks before the scheduled departure for Real Prime, an unexpected development changed everything. A distress signal reached the Institute from a remote research outpost in the Cygnus sector. A wild Shadowmoor had appeared near their facility, but instead of attacking, it remained at the perimeter, producing vocalizations similar to those recorded during the ambassador's sessions. "It's trying to communicate," Marcus realized immediately, This validates everything we've hypothesized. They're capable of social learning even in the wild. An emergency response team was assembled, with Marcus and Professor Zelnara as the primary contact specialists. Within hours, they were aboard a high-speed transport vessel bound for the outpost. Upon arrival, they found the situation even more remarkable than reported. The wild shadow moor had maintained its position outside the facility for 3 days without any aggressive actions. Sensor readings indicated its biometric patterns matched those of the ambassador during communication sessions. "It's waiting," Marcus said with certainty. "It's specifically waiting for someone to respond." With Colonel Zreth's security team positioned at a distance, Marcus approached the perimeter where the creature waited. As soon as it saw him, the shadow moor produced the now familiar greeting vocalization. Marcus responded with the same sound pattern, then slowly sat cross-legged on the ground, mirroring his first encounter with the ambassador. The wild shadow moor studied him for a long moment. Then, to the astonishment of everyone watching, mimicked his posture, sitting back on its haunches in a non-threatening position. "Extraordinary," Professor Zelnara whispered into her recorder. "Complete behavioral mirroring. This suggests knowledge transfer between specimens. They're communicating with each other about us." Over the next 5 days, Marcus established the same rapport with this wild shadow moor that had taken weeks to develop with the ambassador. The creature accepted, offered food, responded to basic instructions, and even allowed the research team to attach a non-invasive monitoring device to track its movements when it eventually returned to the wilderness. Before departing, Marcus conducted one final session. The shadow moor approached closer than ever before, lowering its massive head until it was level with Marcus's face. For several seconds, they simply regarded each other, predator and human, separated by evolution but connected by mutual curiosity. Then, the creature made a new sound, one not previously recorded in any interaction. It was softer, almost musical, with a resonance that seemed to vibrate the air between them. "What's it saying?" Professor Zelnara asked, her scientific detachment momentarily forgotten. Marcus smiled. "I don't know exactly, but I think it might be trying to tell us that we've only begun to understand." As they prepared to return to the Institute, the research team watched the shadow moor disappear into the forest surrounding the outpost. But unlike every previous encounter with its species, this one ended not with destruction, but with promise. "We need to completely revise the interstellar communication protocols," Professor Zelnara announced during their return journey. "Every assumption about predator species needs to be reconsidered." Marcus nodded, his thoughts already turning to the broader implications. "The question isn't whether we can communicate with them, but why we ever assumed we couldn't." Upon their return, they found the Institute transformed. News of the successful wild contact had spread throughout the academic community. Applications for the xenobiology program had tripled. Students from species that had traditionally avoided predator studies were now requesting placements in the communication program. The ambassador greeted Marcus with evident excitement, producing a complex series of vocalizations that the analysis program translated as recognition, welcome, and curiosity about where he had been. "They're not just intelligent," Marcus explained to a gathering of faculty and students. "They're social, emotional beings with their own form of culture. Our mistake was projecting our fears onto them instead of attempting to understand their perspective." As the field expedition to Riel Prime continued its preparations, Marcus found himself reflecting on the journey that had begun with a simple question in a classroom. How many other misunderstandings might be waiting to be corrected? How many species had been classified as threats simply because no one had attempted to communicate? The final approval for the expedition came on the anniversary of Marcus's first encounter with the ambassador. To mark the occasion, the Institute held a special demonstration. Under carefully controlled conditions, the ambassador was allowed to enter the main lecture hall where students observed from a safe distance. The Shadowmoor moved with deliberate grace, showing none of the aggression that had defined its species in scientific literature. It responded to Marcus's instructions, demonstrated its vocabulary of sounds, and even approached several brave students who had volunteered to attempt communication. Prismel, now leading her own research team on Shadowmoor vocalizations, produced a light pattern that the ambassador had been trained to recognize. The creature responded with the corresponding sound, completing a cross-species communication circuit that would have been unimaginable a year earlier. What we're witnessing, Professor Zelnara told the assembled students, is not just interspecies communication. It's the beginning of interspecies understanding. Human Nakamura didn't just question our assumptions. He showed us that respect transcends evolutionary boundaries. As the demonstration concluded, the ambassador returned to Marcus's side. Together, they stood before the holographic display where, 1 year earlier, the Shadowmoor had been presented as nothing more than a killing machine. Now, the same display showed data mapping the creature's communication patterns, social behaviors, and cognitive capabilities. The universe is full of shadows, Marcus told the students. But shadows exist only where light hasn't reached. Our job, as scientists and as sentient beings, is to shine that light, not with weapons, but with courage, curiosity, and respect. That night, as Hollow Arc 07 continued its eternal orbit around the dying star, Marcus stood at the observation window. Beyond the glass, the vastness of space stretched infinitely, filled with worlds and species waiting to be understood. In the reflection of the transparent aluminum, he could see the ambassador standing behind him, its red eyes, no longer threatening but watchful, curious, alive with intelligence. Two beings from worlds light years apart, separated by evolution, but united by something more fundamental, the desire to connect across the void. Tomorrow, they would begin the journey to Real Prime, returning the ambassador to its homeworld, not as a captive, but as a bridge between species. What they would discover there remained unknown. But the question that had started everything continued to echo. If we can understand the Shadowmoor, what other connections await us among the stars? As if sensing his thoughts, the ambassador produced the soft, melodic sound that had come to signify contentment. Marcus turned from the window and nodded to his unlikely friend. "Yes," he said quietly. "I think we're ready too." On Real Prime, other Shadowmoors moved through ancient forests beneath twin moons, unaware that everything was about to change. The galaxy's most feared predators were about to meet the one species that had stopped running long enough to listen. And in that meeting lay the potential to rewrite history, not through conquest or survival, but through the simple, revolutionary act of mutual understanding. The Shadowmoor took one final look at the habitat that had been its home for so long. Then, with deliberate purpose, it turned toward the transport vessel that would carry it home. Its massive paws moved with surprising lightness, each step carrying it toward a future neither humans nor Shadowmoors could have imagined. Behind them, Professor Zelnara watched, her scientific detachment finally giving way to wonder. "In all my years," she murmured, "I never thought I would see this day." Marcus smiled as the ambassador boarded the vessel. Not as cargo, but as a passenger, perhaps even as a colleague. "That's the beauty of science, Professor. The moment we think we know everything is precisely when we discover how much we have left to learn." As the transport doors closed, sealing human and Shadowmoor together for the journey to Real Prime, a new chapter began, not just for two species, but for a galaxy that had defined itself through division rather than connection. The stars waited, patient and eternal. And somewhere among them, other misunderstood creatures looked toward the heavens, perhaps wondering if anyone would ever come who would listen rather than fear, understand rather than destroy. The Shadowmoor settled into the specially designed chamber aboard the transport. its red eyes fixed on the viewport, where stars streaked past as they accelerated to jump speed. For the first time in its existence, it was traveling among the stars, not as a feared monster, but as an ambassador of its kind. Marcus sat nearby, recording his observations. "Day 1 of transit to Real Prime," he dictated. "Subject continues to display curiosity about space travel. Heart rate and body temperature remain within normal parameters, despite the novel environment." He paused, watching as the creature examined its surroundings with methodical interest. "Personal note," he added. "I can't help but wonder how history might have been different if our first contact with the Shadowmoor had been guided by curiosity rather than fear." Throughout the station they had left behind, students continued the work that Marcus had begun. In laboratories and simulation chambers, they re-examined every assumption about predator species, searching for signs of communication potential that had been overlooked. Arioth led a team developing new translation algorithms based on the Shadowmoor vocalizations. His crystalline form sparkled with complex calculations as he mapped sound patterns to probable meanings. "We've identified 87 distinct vocalizations," he reported to Professor Zelnara. "Each corresponds to a specific context or need. This isn't just reaction, it's language." Buzzwick, who had once hidden in his shell at the mere mention of Shadowmoors, now coordinated the habitat designs for the next phase of research. "If we're going to invite more specimens to participate," he explained, manipulating a holographic blueprint, "we need environments that feel secure from their perspective, not just ours." The Nebulan trio had taken on perhaps the most challenging task, reviewing historical records of Shadowmoor encounters to identify missed communication attempts. Their diffuse form moved through data streams, illuminating patterns that individual researchers might have overlooked. 17 documented cases, they reported through their translator. 17 instances where Shadowmoors displayed non-aggressive behavior before attacks occurred. In each case, human or alien actions were interpreted as threats. Prismo's light pattern dimmed with regret. "We've been the aggressors all along, without even realizing it." As this realization spread throughout the Institute and beyond, other research facilities began reporting similar findings, with different predator species. On Centauri Prime, researchers established preliminary communication with crystal mantises, creatures previously thought to be mindless killers. In the Orion sector, a team successfully created a rudimentary translation matrix for the vocalizations of Void Reapers. The paradigm was shifting across galactic science. What had begun with one question in a classroom was becoming a revolution in interspecies understanding. Aboard the transport vessel, now 3 days into their journey, Marcus conducted the daily communication session with the ambassador. The Shadowmoor had learned to respond to 20 basic commands and could initiate interaction by producing specific sounds to indicate needs or observations. Today, however, something new occurred. The creature approached the viewport where the swirling energies of hyperspace created psychedelic patterns. It studied the display for several minutes, then turned to Marcus and produced a series of sounds never before recorded. Marcus checked the translation algorithm, but it offered no interpretation. This was something entirely new. "What are you trying to tell me?" he asked gently. The Shadowmoor repeated the sounds, then gestured toward the viewport with one massive paw. It then turned back to Marcus and tilted its head in what had come to represent a question. "The stars?" Marcus guessed. "Hyperspace? You're asking about how we travel?" The creature produced an affirmative sound, a low, rumbling purr that the team had identified as confirmation. Marcus felt a chill run through him. The Shadowmoor wasn't just learning to respond to human communication. It was asking questions about concepts beyond its evolutionary experience. It was displaying abstract curiosity, the hallmark of advanced intelligence. He activated his communication link to the Institute. "Professor Zelnara, we need to update the cognitive assessment parameters. The ambassador just asked about hyperspace travel. It's demonstrating conceptual thinking beyond anything we anticipated. Thousands of light years away. Professor Zelnara's skin rippled with excitement. This changes everything. Human Nakamura. If they can conceptualize space travel, they might understand the concept of different worlds, different species, perhaps even different rights and responsibilities. It means, Marcus said quietly, that they're not just intelligent predators. They're people, Professor, different from us, but people nonetheless. The implications of this realization would take years to fully process. If Shadow Moors were recognized as sentient beings with rights, the historical eradication campaigns against them would need to be reclassified as genocide. Reparations might be required. Diplomatic relations would need to be established. The galaxy's understanding of personhood itself would need to expand. On the 7th day of transit, the vessel dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of the real system. The ambassador's behavior changed immediately. Its posture straightened, its attention focused completely on the viewports. As the system's primary star came into view, the creature produced a long, complex vocalization that the translation algorithm interpreted as recognition and anticipation. "It knows we're home," Marcus noted in his log. Remarkable spatial awareness and memory. As they approached Riel Prime, the scanners detected something unexpected. A gathering of Shadow Moors near the designated landing zone. More than 20 specimens had congregated in a clearing, their posture alert, but non-aggressive. "They're waiting for us," Marcus realized. "Somehow, they know we're coming." Colonel Zreth, commanding the security detail, immediately raised shields. "Could be an ambush. Recommend alternate landing site." But Marcus shook his head. "No. Look at their posture. They're in the same non-threatening stance the ambassador uses during communication sessions. They're expecting us." Professor Zelnara studied the sensor readings. Human Nakamura is correct. Their biometric signatures match peaceful interaction patterns. But how could they know? The answer came from the Nebulon researchers back at the Institute. Shadow Moors possess a form of long-range communication we didn't detect. Their urgent message explained. Low-frequency infrasound that can travel hundreds of kilometers. The ambassador has been communicating with the wild population since we entered the system. As the transport vessel made its final approach, Marcus turned to the ambassador. "Are they your family? Your friends?" The Shadow Moor produced an affirmative sound, followed by the same melodic tone it had used when trying to express complex ideas beyond the translation matrix. The landing was tense but controlled. Security protocols remained in place, but with a crucial difference. Weapons were set to stun rather than lethal force. And communication specialists took position at the front of the expedition rather than behind defensive lines. As the vessel's doors opened onto the verdant landscape of Riel Prime, Marcus stood beside the ambassador. The air was thick with unfamiliar scents. The gravity slightly stronger than Earth standard. Twin suns cast overlapping shadows across the clearing where the wild Shadow Moors waited. For a moment, no one moved. Then the ambassador stepped forward, producing a complex series of sounds that echoed across the clearing. The wild Shadow Moors responded in kind, their vocalizations creating a symphony of communication that no human had ever heard, or at least had ever lived to document. "They're exchanging information," Professor Zelnara whispered, her scientific detachment momentarily overwhelmed by the historical significance of the moment. "This is first contact, human Nakamura, not our arrival, but this conversation happening before us." Slowly, one of the wild Shadow Moors approached. It was larger than the ambassador, its fur bearing scars that suggested years of survival in a harsh environment. It stopped several meters away, studying the humans with evident curiosity rather than hostility. Marcus, following the protocol they had established, sat cross-legged on the ground. The wild Shadow Moor observed this. Then, to the astonishment of the entire expedition, mimicked the posture. "It's learned from the ambassador," Marcus said quietly. "It's accepting our non-threatening gesture." Over the following weeks, the expedition established a research base on the edge of Shadowmoor territory. Each day brought new discoveries. The creatures lived in complex social groups, used rudimentary tools, and had developed sophisticated hunting techniques that minimized energy expenditure. They weren't mindless killers, but efficient predators that had evolved to survive in a challenging environment. Most remarkably, they demonstrated an unprecedented willingness to interact with the human researchers. Under the ambassador's guidance, wild shadow moors began approaching the base, participating in communication sessions, and even allowing limited physical examinations. "They're curious about us," Marcus explained during a transmission to the Institute. "Just as we're curious about them. The difference is, they never had the chance to satisfy that curiosity without being attacked." 3 months into the expedition, a breakthrough occurred. Using the enhanced translation matrix developed by Arioth, the team managed to establish basic two-way communication with the wild shadow moors. The creatures could now express simple needs, describe their environment, and even ask rudimentary questions about the humans. "Ask them," Professor Zelnara suggested during one session, "why they attacked human settlements." Marcus relayed the question through the translation matrix. The response from the wild Shadowmoor leader was simple but profound. "Loud machines, bright lights, smelled like fear, thought attack coming." The misunderstanding that had led to 17 species extinctions became heartbreakingly clear. The industrial machinery of early settlements, the powerful spotlights used to illuminate alien forests, the pheromones of fearful colonists, all had been interpreted by shadow moors as signs of imminent attack. They hadn't been aggressors but defenders, protecting their territory from what they perceived as a threat. "We've been wrong about everything," Marcus said quietly. "Every death, every extinction. It was all because we didn't know how to say hello." As this understanding spread throughout the Eternal Stellar Alliance, policies began to change. The automatic extermination protocols for Shadowmoor encounters were suspended. Communication specialists were assigned to frontier outposts. A proposal was put forward to establish a protected reservation on Riel Prime, where shadow moors could live without human interference while voluntary communication continued. 6 months after their arrival, the expedition prepared to return to the Institute. The ambassador, however, would remain on Riel Prime, reunited with its kind, but now serving as a bridge between species. On their final day, Marcus sat with the ambassador and the wild Shadowmoor leader at the edge of the clearing. No translation matrix was needed for the emotions that passed between them: respect, curiosity, and something approaching friendship. "We'll come back," Marcus promised. "And next time, we'll bring more people who want to learn, not fear." The ambassador produced the melodic sound that had come to signify understanding beyond words. The wild leader mimicked it, adding a deeper resonance that the translation matrix interpreted as affirmation. As the transport vessel lifted off from Riel Prime, Marcus watched the shadow moors gather below, their massive forms dwarfed by the ancient forests they called home. They weren't monsters to be feared, but complex beings with their own perspective, their own history, their own right to exist. Back at the Institute, the findings from Riel Prime transformed the curriculum. Professor Zelnara's course, once titled Apex Predatory Evolution, was renamed Interspecies Communication and Understanding. Students now learned not just how to identify dangerous creatures, but how to establish peaceful contact with them. Prismel led a new research initiative focused on identifying communication patterns across predator species. "What we discovered with shadow moors may apply to dozens of other misunderstood species," she explained, her bioluminescence glowing with academic excitement. Buswick designed new contact protocols that emphasized respect rather than fear. The first rule he instructed students, is to assume intelligence and intention, not mindless aggression. Arioth's translation algorithms became standard equipment for frontier expeditions, programmed to recognize potential communication attempts from unknown species. And the Nebulon trio created a living memorial, not of destruction, but of connection. A constantly updating database of successful communication techniques that could be accessed by researchers throughout the galaxy. 1 year after that first classroom question, Marcus stood once again before the holographic display in the lecture hall. But now, instead of a fearsome predator, the hologram showed footage from Riel Prime, Shadowmoors and humans working together to understand each other. The universe is not divided between predators and prey, he told the assembled students. It's connected by the possibility of understanding. The most dangerous thing in the galaxy isn't the Shadowmoor. It's the assumption that different means incompatible. As he spoke, a message arrived from the ongoing expedition on Riel Prime. The ambassador had successfully taught 3 more wild Shadowmoors to use the translation matrix. They had begun asking questions about human history, technology, and culture. One question in particular stood out. A young Shadowmoor had asked, through the imperfect medium of the translation algorithm, "Why humans afraid so long? Why not talk sooner?" Marcus read this aloud to the class, then looked up at the expectant faces of 40 different species gathered to learn. "That," he said quietly, "is the question we should all be asking. And the answer begins with each of us choosing curiosity over fear, communication over conflict." As the class ended, students filed out, discussing the implications of the Shadowmoor breakthrough for their own research. Prismel lingered, her bioluminescence pulsing with a question. "Human Nakamura," she said finally, "that first day in class, when you suggested communication might be possible, did you truly believe it? Or were you simply asking a theoretical question?" Marcus smiled. "Both, I suppose. I believed it might be possible, but I needed to ask the question to discover if I was right." Prismel's light pattern shifted to indicate understanding. "One question changed everything. That's how science advances," Marcus replied, "not just by having answers, but by asking better questions." As he gathered his materials, Marcus glanced at the holographic display once more. The Shadowmoor's red eyes stared back, no longer a symbol of terror, but a reminder of possibility. Somewhere on Riel Prime, the ambassador was continuing the work they had begun, building a bridge between species, one sound, one gesture at a time. And across the galaxy, other questions were being asked, other assumptions challenged. The universe was vast, filled with creatures shaped by different evolutionary paths, different needs, different perspectives. But beneath those differences lay a shared capacity for curiosity, for connection, for understanding. All it took was the courage to sit down instead of running away, to listen instead of fear, to respect instead of destroy. All it took was one human willing to see a predator, not as a monster, but as a being with its own story to tell. As Marcus left the classroom, he thought about how far they had come, and how far they still had to go. The journey of understanding had only just begun. But the first step, that crucial moment when the Shadowmoor had backed away instead of attacking, had changed everything. Sometimes, the most revolutionary act wasn't fighting back against the darkness, but simply shining a light and waiting to see what emerged.